I'm Mike and welcome to Aircrew Interview. This episode we chat with Tony Paxton on his time flying the Tornado GR1 and F2 and F3. He mainly chats about the differences between the two and also his roles on both air defence and air to ground. So if you like what we do here, head over to patreon.com/aircrew interview to help us out for as little as $1 per month. Also visit us at aircrewinterview.tv for all of our other interviews and to sign up to our newsletter. Enjoy! When did you first become interested in aviation?
Well, it was when I was 7 years old. We were on holiday down in Cornwall and my father said, shall we go to the Scilly Isles? And we didn't fancy the boat because both he and I suffer from travel sickness. And from St Just Airport, which is Land's End, you could go in a de Havilland Dragon Rapide. And that was my first ever flight out to the Scilly Isles. And I loved every second of it. I was 7 years old and we had a day in St Mary's and then flew back, and that was it. I was hooked.
Brilliant. So when did you join the RAF?
I joined the RAF in 1968. But I was lucky enough to learn to fly while I was still at school.
So could you tell us some of the aircraft you trained on?
Well, I didn't fly any piston engine airplanes while I was in the Royal Air Force because I already had a PPL. So I went straight onto the Jet Provost Mark III and then 4. Then from there down to Valley to fly the Nat. For various reasons, I ended up holding on the Nat as well. So quite unusual for a non-QFI. I got nearly 250 hours flying the Nat. From the Nat we went to Chivenor on the Hunter, which was quite exciting because it was the first single-seat aeroplane that you'd ever flown. And of course it was used as a trainer then, but it had been a frontline fighter. And that was quite exciting. And that was just weaponry and tactics. Finished there in summer of 1972. And then went up to Coltishall to learn how to fly the Lightning.
So, how did you feel about going on to Lightnings?
Delighted, because in those days we were expecting new aeroplanes. We were expecting, they had been expecting TSR-2 and that got delayed. So then there was the F-111 and that didn't happen. Phantoms were going to come, but we didn't have the aeroplanes. And so people going through fast jet training weren't getting fast jet postings. So I went through with 7 or 8 other guys through the NAT training, and we only got 2 fast jet postings, one to Harriers and one to Lightning. So I consider myself very lucky to get fast jets at all.
So what was it like going from a subsonic aircraft to a supersonic aircraft?
It wasn't really an issue because there is no sound barrier. That's a myth from the movies of the 50s. It's just an indication on a dial. And so the main thing with the Lightning was all the instrumentation as far as speed and height was concerned was designed for when the airplane was supersonic. And so you had a massive altimeter error as you approached Mach 1. So much so that it was your Mach number plus 2 was the error. So at Mach 0.9 add 2 is 1,100 foot error in the altimeter. And then as you went supersonic, the altimeter wound up to read accurately. Oh, wow. Doesn't sound too bad, but when you're down at 500 feet at night over the sea with the altimeter reading a negative, that can get your attention.
So what was it actually like to fly?
It was a lovely aeroplane to fly. It was actually a very easy aeroplane to fly. Once one got used to the approach speed, which was 165 knots coming down the glide path. What was difficult with the Lightning was operating it, because it was a single-seater, day, night, radar. The radar controller had 14 separate controls, all to be manipulated with your left hand whilst you're trying to fly the aeroplane. It did have a fairly decent autopilot. In fact, it would do an auto ILS, would you believe, for a 1960s aeroplane. Wouldn't auto land, but it would do quite a good approach.
Yeah. So was it a capable aircraft at this time?
It's a much maligned aeroplane for 2 reasons. It's got a reputation for only having half an hour's fuel, and it was underarmed, if you like, because it only had 2 missiles. The early Marks, which I flew in Germany, the F2A, had 2 guns. And then in their wisdom, the government and the MOD decided that guns were no longer required. There would never be any more dogfights. So the Mark III and Mark VI were designed just to have 2 missiles. Of course, eventually they realised, no, you are going to have to dogfight at some stage if you get into hostilities. And the Mark VI has 2 Aden cannons in the front of the fuel tank, and which poses a couple of problems. Cooling guns with fuel seems a bit hazardous. The other thing is that the guns are a long way from the pilot's eye line, whereas the Mark IIA, if you imagine this were a Lightning cockpit, the Mark I and the IIA, the guns were just here, just behind you. So the difference between sight line of the pilot and the actual muzzles of the gun was only about 2 feet or so. In the Mark VI, with the guns in the belly tank, it was nearly 8 feet, which of course adds all sorts of problems to the sighting solution.
So overall, did you enjoy your time in the Lightning?
I did, thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a great airplane to fly. The environment was cramped and hot, and the view over one's shoulder wasn't terribly good, but it was a delight to fly, and a very capable airplane. We had a thing in Germany called Dialer Lightning, which was as a number that all the NATO squadrons in Germany had, and if they wanted us to bounce them, they'd call and tell us roughly where they were going to be, and off we go. It was a very successful thing, and we were fine until the F-15s arrived.
Yeah.
In fact, when they first arrived, if it 2v2 or 4v4, we actually did very well because they had a great airplane, but they didn't have much in the way of tactics.
Yeah.
One-on-one, forget it. Absolutely forget it. I remember the first time I got behind an F-15, I was just bringing the sight to bear, and then I didn't actually see it turn. It just seemed to change shape and come back at me.
So Pax, then you moved on to the Tornado. How did this happen?
Well, the Lightning was coming to the end of its in-service life, and I really didn't want to go and fly the F4 on air defence. So I thought, well, how about a new aeroplane? I didn't fancy camping, so I didn't want to go to the Harrier. And the Tornado was coming along, so I thought, well, I'll give this mud-moving lark a try and fly a new aeroplane. So that's how I got into that.
Was it common to go from air to air to air to ground in them days?
Not very. Some guys had gone from the Lightning to the Jaguar, and a few of us did go on to the GR1 in those early days, but no, it wasn't common.
Obviously, there must have been a massive difference coming from the Lightning to the Tornado cockpit. How did you get your head around that?
Well, it was rather pleasant for the cockpit. It was a quiet environment. It was temperature control was very, very good, and there was a huge amount of room. Very comfortable. The biggest thing I had to get used to was the guy sitting in the back, of course.
Could you tell us about your first trip?
Well, you're asking me to remember back over 35 years now, but I think I was impressed with, as I say, the quietness of the aeroplane. It was nice, crisp aeroplane. The controls was fine. It was easy to fly, very pleasant aeroplane. There were some maintenance issues. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But no, the instruction was good. All the instructors were pretty well standardised between the 3 nations. And although looking in my logbook, it was quite a few trips before you actually went off with a nav for the first time. I think it was 8 or 9 trips. So we did, with an instructor pilot, we did the basic conversion, the emergencies, of course, because you had to be able to land the aeroplane with the wings stuck back in 67, which was an interesting approach. Something like 210 knots, I think, was the approach speed. Formation. So it was quite a lot before you actually went off with the first nav. And you had to get used to the terrain following radar, of course, as well, which was a whole new ball game.
Yeah. So could you describe some of the training sorties you actually did, and like how did you find it coming from air to air?
Well, we did a lot of low level in the air defence world, chasing the mud movers. So I was quite happy and confident down at low level, comfortable down there. It didn't cause me any major problems. Just getting used to the navigator, getting used to crew cooperation, working with him right instead of against him. Single seat flying is absolutely lovely, but if you're going to go to war, you really want that guy with the extra pair of eyes. In fact, I did suggest that really it should have the seat facing backwards, but that didn't go down too well.
So, did you actually ever get to drop any live weapons?
I did when we got to the squadron. In fact, that was quite unusual. I think with a mud mover, normally you drop maybe half a dozen 1,000-pounders during a tour. Well, we dropped dozens of them because we were sort of an extension of a trials unit, if you like. And I must have dropped a dozen or 15,000-pounders in the first year flying the aeroplane on the squadron. In fact, I dropped 4 for a photograph, for a publicity photograph for BAE. 1,000-pounders, we used to go up to Garvey for live 1,000-pounders. Yep. There's an island off the north coast of Scotland called Garvey Island, and it is a proper range, and the island is about the same size as the Navy destroyer, and so 1,000-pounders are dropped on that. It's had a lot of bombs on it.
I can imagine. So the aircraft at this stage, was it actually combat ready, or was it quite new to the Air Force?
It was brand new. I was privileged to be on the first ever squadron out of all the 3 nations. 9 Squadron was the first of them all. We had not problems with serviceability, but as I understand it, the Air Force, when they bought the Phantoms, they bought a spares package. And they ended up with a warehouse full of spares they never needed. So it was a different strategy for the Tornado. And the idea was we'd fly it, see what was often going wrong, and then buy the spares we needed. And so it was a bit frustrating those first year or so, because quite often the aeroplanes were unserviceable because we didn't have the spares. But it was a great aeroplane to fly, and of course I was not only learning to fly a new aeroplane, I was learning a complete new job as well.
Oh yeah. So how long before you got sent to your first squadron?
Well, I think we did about 4 months at Triple T Cottesmore, and then 3 or 4 months on the south side of the airfield at Honington before moving across to 9 Squadron, which were in hardened aircraft shelters, which was new to us all because the airplanes weren't on the line. So it was, I would guess, about a year from being told you're going on Tornadoes, report to North Luffenham for the aeromedical training. It was probably a year to get onto the squadron.
So what was the main role of 9 Squadron?
Well, we were strike attack. No QRA for strike aeroplanes in the UK, of course. And the big thing was that we suddenly had an aeroplane that was all-weather capable for attack at low level. And there is something quite eerie about flying around at night, hands off, with the hilltops going by in the Lake District. That's a bit unnerving. And there was an area in North Scotland where we could actually go and do it IMC as well. It is in cloud, low level, on autopilot.
So did the terrain following radar, did that work every time? It must have had to.
It was fail safe, and it was very good. In fact, when we first got it, it was too good. It was too sensitive. And it's designed, if it sees a big target, i.e. a hill or a mast or anything like that, it would fly you over it at whatever level you'd set. And the lowest level was 200 feet and the highest was 1,500 feet. But it had a flaw in as much as if it saw a large return, as in a lot of energy, it would try and fly you over it. So for instance, if you're flying over a marshalling yard full of rails and metal coaches and locomotives, it would see that as a hill and try and fly you over it. So in the end they tweaked it and ended up with a sensitivity that was only 10% of the original. Wow. That was quite sufficient to...
That was enough.
Yeah, worked very well.
So going to the cockpit, could you describe it for us, and how long did it take you to get used to the wing sweep?
Well, the cockpit was, as I said before, very, very comfortable. It had a head-up display, so all the instrument flying was done head-up, and the speed, attitude, and everything was available head up. There were all the head down instruments as well, of course, and right in the middle of the instrument panel was a moving map display, which was absolutely magic. And there were 3 settings. You could either have an airways chart for flying at high level, or a 500,000 topographical map, which was just like flying along with a map in your hand, except it was down there and you had your accurate position. And so you just fly along and you say, oh, there's an airfield ahead, I'll go left 10 degrees to avoid that. Or there's a town over there, I'll avoid that. It was absolutely magical and completely new to me. The head-up display was marvellous, and it was not attitude. Most aeroplanes, even modern airliners today, you fly on attitude. So on the approach you have to fly maybe 3 degrees nose up or 5 degrees nose up, depending on the configuration. But the Tornado head-up display was flight path. So if you wanted to go 3 degrees down, you put the aircraft symbol 3 degrees down and you went 3 degrees down. Fly level, whether it's at 150 knots or 550 knots, aircraft symbol on the horizon and the instruments, and you flew level. We did have one problem with it when we first got it, which was the radio altimeter. The display for the radio altimeter in the head-up display was just numbers. It was either plus or minus. And if you were descending or climbing, just the numbers just tumbled round. And it was very difficult to work out what was going on. So we went back to them and said, look, we really do need a dial here.
Would help.
So after a while, the software changed and we had a dial going around so you could tell which way it was moving and the rate at which it was moving as well, which was much more comfortable.
You also flew the Tornado in Germany. Could you tell us about this?
Well, I was lucky enough to be on the first ever squadron at Honington, and then there was setting up Tornadoes in Germany at Laarbruch and at Bruggen. And I was posted with a colleague of mine from 9, Stu Peach, who is currently the Chief of the Defence Staff. And we were both flight lieutenants, and we were sent out to Bruggen to set up 31. And in fact, we were called DES at the time, 31 designate, because 31 Jaguar was still going. And the wing commander, OC-31, was a navigator. So I had the privilege of being the first ever Tornado pilot on 31 Squadron. And it was busy and frustrating work, you know, because you're DES, you're not 31, and no one really wanted to know. And so we were trying to get this organised and get that organised. And we're in this strange situation where Stu and I would strap a Tornado to our backsides and go fly around at 250 feet, 420 knots to relax.
As you do.
To get away from it all.
So how did the flying in Germany differ compared to the UK?
Well, we were still strike attack, but of course in Germany we had QRA, which was very different from air defence QRA, because we weren't going to fly in peacetime. Never got airborne with a nuclear weapon in peacetime. And it was a 15-minute readiness, whereas at Gütersloh it was a 5-minute readiness, and at Bimbrook and Lucas, all the UK air defence was a 10-minute readiness. And to be absolutely honest, some of the guys didn't really take it that seriously. The hooter would go and they'd run out, maybe not completely dressed, if you know what I mean, get in and check in and say, oh, I checked in 3 minutes 10 seconds, wasn't that good? I said, well, yeah, but were you strapped in? Did you have your life jacket on? Could you have flown? Well, no, probably not, but we knew we weren't going to. But we had target study to do all the time, and I actually did we go into a secure environment in a bunker, and we were given a package, the navigator and the pilot sit down and look at the route, and there would be, bearing in mind this was actually when war had kicked off, the QRA, as opposed to a tactical phase. And along the route there'd be a little note saying something like, look left. And the reason you were looking left, because there might be a big bang and flash on the right, and you didn't want to be blinded. And there'd be satellite photographs of the target and all that sort of thing. And I can't remember the exact amount. I think we had to do 4 hours study a month on the targets.
So how long did you spend over in Germany?
I was at Bruggen for about 20 months, just less than 2 years. By that time I'd realised that mud moving wasn't really for me and I wanted to go back to air defence.
Yeah.
And because I was in air defence QWI and I now had quite a bit of Tornado experience, I don't know if they were keen to have me, but they were happy to have me. So, but there wasn't really a slot coming up for me, so I was lucky enough to go to Cottesmore as an instructor there, which was a great time. I really enjoyed that.
Just going back a bit, did you ever fly on any flag exercises?
Yep, during my last month on 31 at Bruggen, we were out in Nellis near Las Vegas for exercise green flag, yeah, which was quite an experience as well. There's an area of desert there where no one is allowed in apart from the green flag participants, or the red flag. The difference between red flag and green flag is that green flag is heavily involved with electronic countermeasures, whereas red flag, there's very little of that in comparison.
Yeah.
And I remember once I was an 8-ship leader there, and we were going towards the target, an 8-ship of Tornadoes down at about 200 feet, doing 500 knots because we were just about to cross the FLOT, which is forward line owned troops. And so you want to get across there quickly. And perfectly timed to go in with us was a EF treble 1 Raven. And we were doing 500 knots at low level. And this Raven came across the top of us, wings back, as if we were standing still. I don't know what speed he was doing, but perfectly timed. Just as we crossed that line, he was there, going in, jamming ahead of us.
You must have been wings back at that speed as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right. So just going back, what was some of the strengths and weaknesses of the GR1?
I think its main strength was that it was comfortable, so the crews were happy. It was very capable. It had very accurate navigation system with multiple ways to fix the kit, as the Harrier guys would call it. It could be fixed by the radar guy with something prominent. The weapon accuracy was very, very good. You could use offsets, radar offsets or visual offsets to drop weapons. For instance, a strike delivery for a nuke, or even conventional 1,000-pounders, if you didn't want to go too close to the target, you could find an offset on the map, which could be anything up to about 10 miles away. If you knew where that was, and you knew exactly in terms of northings, eastings, and the height difference where the target was, you could put that into the computer, which people would laugh at nowadays, the capability of this computer, 64 bits. Anyway, you could put the offset in, mark that either visually on the radar, and the computer would work out when to pull up, and you could pull up the airplane. I think we started at 500 knots, and you just follow the directions in the head-up display, and the weapon would release automatically, and then you could turn and go away. Particularly if it's a nuke, you want to get out the way very, very quickly. And we were getting accuracies in terms of 50, 60 feet, that sort of delivery, which is quite remarkable, because if you think of the wind, the computer only knows the wind when you either flying low or when you release the weapon. Yeah. Of course, it's going to go up into different winds. So that was very impressive. And the TF, of course, the terrain following, that was impressive as well. It was a very similar, it may have been the same system as was in the F111.
Okay.
I know the ground mapping radar was the same, but it wasn't quite as good as the F111. The Americans weren't going to let us have the standard of kit they had. But
what was it like working with the Germans and Italians?
Well, it was fantastic actually. It was very good. There was a great social life. We were training RAF pilots and navigators for the Italian Air Force, and pilots and navigators for the German Air Force and German Navy. So there are actually 4 forces involved, although there were the 3 nations. Of course, there hadn't been very many navigators, if any, in the Italian Air Force or the German Air Force. And so quite a few of the navs were actually pilots who'd been remustered, which they weren't very happy about. But I was an instructor on A Squadron, which was commanded by a German major, a mix of students and pilots. But I remember two students in particular. One was a Italian pilot called Sergio, and it was his first tour. He'd just come out of training, and they'd both been trained in the States. And we were flying in formation one day. They'd come from Arizona and come onto the Tornado. I don't think they'd even been back to Italy. They'd just come straight across. And we used to do formation approaches, one speaking unit, so very close formation. We were going downwind for a GCA, ground controlled approach, which is like an ILS, but you're talked down by the controller. Anyway, we're number 2, sitting on the wing of this guy. I'm in the back, and Sergio, of course, is in the front. And this little Italian voice says, "Eh, sir." "Yes, Sergio?" He said, "There is a cloud ahead." I said, "Yes, Sergio." He said, "Sir, we are going to go into the cloud." I said, "Yes, Sergio, that's why we're in formation." "Okay." Because coming from Arizona, it had seen very little poor weather.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
he was very good, actually, a very, very good guy. And the German nav was quite funny as well. They'd trained in the States, but they had a Boeing 737 over there with Tornado rear cockpits in. I don't know how many, 4 or 5 down the back. And so he was actually very good at using the nav system, very good at it. And we were going high-low one day up to Scotland, and we were crossing the Great Glen. It was a glorious day. We were about 24,000 feet, and you could see the whole of the Great Glen right down from Loch Lynny all the way up to Inverness. And it was absolutely lovely. Anyway, I said to him, I can't remember his name, I said, "So where are we?" And I'm watching in the mirrors, and he goes to the TV tab display and he says, "We are 23 miles from Waypoint Charlie." I said, "Well, I know that, but where are we? Look out, get your chart out, look out at what you can see on the ground and tell me, where are we?" So I look in the mirror and I go back to the TV tab later. "We are 19 miles from Waypoint Charlie." I said, no, look at the ground, look at the chart, match the two, where are we? I mean, we're crossing the Great Glen. It's a pretty easy question to answer. So, same thing again, head right, head left, back to the chart, back to the TV tab. We are 14 miles from Waypoint Charlie. So in the end I said, "Right, turn the TV tabs off." His eyes go, "What?" "Turn them off." No, he's bereft. "Oh, what am I going to do?" I said, "Right, don't worry, you haven't failed this trip. I'm going to show you how to navigate." I rolled it on its back and flew him around Scotland for 45 minutes at low level on a map and a thumb, and he was absolutely amazed. "How did you do that?" "Well, how do you think we used to do it before we had the Tornado?" You know, it wasn't his fault, it was just the way that he'd been trained. But
So, Pax, overall, did you enjoy your time on the GR1?
I did. It was a different experience. It broadened my experience, obviously, and it got me used to flying with a navigator. It also gave me the chance to do some more training, because TTE was the only place in the Air Force where you could train other pilots without being a QFI, Qualified Weapons Instructor. Because the Italians and the Germans had this IP qualification, Instructor Pilot, I did a 10-day course called Competent to Instruct, and I was able to instruct other pilots on how to fly the Tornado. But it was a qualification that I lost as soon as I left, because you had to be a QFI to do any pilot training otherwise in the Air Force. But no, I did thoroughly enjoy it, but I was happy to get back to air defence. There's a fundamental difference between MUB moving and air defence. Strike attack, the target is always on the ground. It's generally stationary, and it's there when you was 3 hours before you took off when you started the planning.
Yeah.
The other thing is nearly everything in strike attack happens behind you. You drop a weapon, and it goes off behind you, or you throw loft, you disappear and it goes off behind you. Nearly everything in air defence is out the front.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, you get scrambled, that's all you know, scrambled, vector this heading, climb to this level. You don't know what you've got to do. You might have to go high, you might have to go low, it might be fast, it might be slow, you might have to kill it, identify it, shadow it, or escort it. It might be something in distress. You know. So the variety in air defence is what appealed to me. I did enjoy the mud moving, but it was very limited. The other thing is, in bad weather, particularly at low level, the mud movers don't go.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas as long as the weather's good enough to land, air defenders will always go and get everyone.
Exactly. So you then went back to air defence. How did this happen?
Well, I was a qualified weapons instructor on the Lightning when I left the Lightning Force. So I had a qualification which was valuable to the air defence world. And by this time I had over 1,000 hours experience on the airframe. So with the F2, then F3 coming in, I think it was useful for me to go back and apply both sets of experience to the air defence world.
So how much training do you have to have going on to the F2?
Well, actually training onto flying the aeroplane was very quick. Obviously I had plenty of time on it. Getting used to the weapon system, and all my air defence flying have been single seat, of course, apart from when I was instructing in the T-Bird. So again, I had to get used to doing it rather differently, with the navigator having complete control of the radar. But it didn't take too long. At the time we didn't have a Tornado F3 simulator at Coningsby. We did have a trainer for the radar, which was called the TATE, the Tornado Air Intercept Trainer. And we used that. We had a procedures trainer for emergencies, and all the rest was done on the airplane. We had a few F2s. I think there were less than 20 were built, I think, the F2s. They rapidly moved on to the F3. So I flew the F2 a few times whilst I was on the OCU, which I've been on before, funnily enough, twice. 229 OCU was where I flew Hunters at Chivener, and 65 Squadron, which was the reserve plate, had been the squadron I flew at Coltishall on 226 OCU on the Lightning, so I've been on both outfits before. We did quite a lot of training actually. We've learned to fly the aeroplane, learned to use the radar, and then went out to Deci Momano for the ACMI range out there, which is the Air Combat Manoeuvring Instrumentation range, and did DACT with F-16s and Jaguars and Phantoms whilst we were on the course. That was quite interesting. And then back to Coningsby, and we actually did air-to-air gunnery on the course as well. And the gun was very good, very accurate. The system was very good, and I think everyone qualified in a matter of 2 or 3 sorties. So that was very good. And there was a strange anomaly whilst I was there, because I'd been an instrument rating examiner on the Tornado GR1, and it's an anomaly of the system where one is an examiner on a type, not a mark. And so whilst I was still a student on the course, I was actually doing instrument rating exams on other students to help them out, because it was a new airplane, and the staff at the OCU didn't have many instrument rating examiners, so that was quite unusual for a student to do that.
Well, famously, it had the blue circle radar. Was this just the F2?
Yes, and in fact, by the time we got there were only 3 or 4 airplanes with no radar in, so it wasn't too much of a hindrance for us. But I know when they first setting up the OCU, and when the guys went through for 29 Squadron, which was the first ADV squadron, they did have trouble with the concrete ballast. Yeah.
So coming from the GR1, what were the first initial thoughts of what were the differences basically?
Well, the airplane was very similar. The flying controls and the systems were all almost identical. It was a much longer nose on the airplane. For 2 main reason was to accommodate 4 sky flash on the belly of the airplane, and the radome was longer as well. So the whole aeroplane, I think, was something like 50 inches longer, nearly 5 feet longer. And that gave the opportunity to put an extra fuel tank in, which was called the O tank, just behind the navigator. So it had quite a good endurance, even clean, and we flew the aeroplane clean for a long time.
Yeah. Was that a lot more agile than the GR1?
I don't think it was, actually. It had a system called spills. Now, I honestly don't remember if the airplane had it originally or it came later during the time I was flying it. But spills was spin and instant limiting system, which automatically was supposed to stop you spinning or stalling the airplane. But being a fly-by-wire airplane, it was easy to apply that into the software. But every now and then, you did get the idea at the limits of the envelope that you maybe weren't actually flying the airplane, it was being flown for you, which was a bit strange.
So what were your first combat squadron?
Well, I was on number 5 squadron at Coningsby, which was a squadron I'd been on before as a Lightning squadron at Bimbrook. And in fact, the 2 squadrons were side by side for a while. 5 squadron at Bimbrook with the Lightnings, and 5 squadron designate, I suppose, at Coningsby. Were together for about 5-6 months, I think. And then eventually, when we were combat ready, the 5 Squadron Lightning disbanded and we were it.
So can you describe some of the training sorties you conducted on the F3, F2?
Well, mostly once we were on the squadron, I've already told you about the OCU. Once we were on the squadron, it was practice intercepts, CAPs, combat air patrols, and high level, low level, just the whole gamut. As I said before, the fundamental difference between air defence and mud moving was you had to be able to cope with anything from sea level to 70,000 feet, 100 knots to Mach 3, and so constantly training for that sort of thing.
So obviously you flew the Lightning on 5. Was it a big difference coming to the Tornado? Could you see the capabilities were a lot better?
The radar was much more capable, of course. It had track well scan, much greater range, it had a look down capability. And the aeroplane, when we were flying it initially, had 6 missiles as well, 4 Skyflash and 2 Sidewinders on the inboard of the inboard pylons. The F3 didn't have the outboard pylons, it only had the inboard pylons. So yes, it was more capable from terms of radar and the weapons. The semi-active Skyflash could be fired at very long range, long before you got to what we call the merge, when you actually get to see the targets visually. However, you can't really take a bomber and turn it into a fighter. The Tornado ADV was never an air superiority fighter. It was a bomber killer, really. Great air display aeroplane, superb power down at low level, but take it anywhere above 15 or 20,000 feet and the Lightning would see it off easily, no trouble at all.
So how did it fare in DACT against the likes of F-16s or F-18s?
Well, it had to be tactics, really. You certainly couldn't hold your own against an F-15 or an F-16 in close combat. It just wasn't that sort of aeroplane. It did turn well with the wings forward and full reheat, but that was a huge penalty in fuel, whereas the Lightning, you could fight it quite well in cold power, certainly up to 20,000 feet or so, only using the reheat when you needed it. But as soon as you got above about 10,000 feet in the Tornado, you needed reheat all the time.
So did you ever intercept any bears?
Only on the Lightning. I intercepted a bear on the Lightning. On QRA on the Tornado, the only Russian I intercepted was a Coot, which is a transport aeroplane, which the Russians, it's a 4-engine turboprop aeroplane, which I think the Russians were using for reconnaissance and surveillance over, I think it was a naval exercise in the North Sea. However, I was lucky enough to intercept some MiG-29s when they came to Farnborough in 1988. They were the first Russian fighters to come to the UK since the Second World War, and it was deemed appropriate that we should go and meet them somewhere over the English Channel and escort them into Farnborough, which was a great idea. And we were clean, had no tanks, no weapons on the aeroplane because we didn't want to frighten them. But we did have a tanker. There were two of us. We came off the tanker and went off to intercept these Russian MiGs. Now, as I said earlier, the Tornado was not a high-level aeroplane, and these MiGs were at 43,000 feet. So in cold power, because it was designed as an air superiority fighter. So we got vectored onto them, came round the back, intercepted them, but we were in almost full reheat to stay up there with them at 43,000 feet. And luckily they were on a different frequency because the Russians didn't have UHF, they only had VHF. So we asked London military to invent an air traffic reason to get them down, which they did. They got them down to about 28,000 feet, and then we were happy there. Lucky enough to get promoted while I was still on 5 Squadron, so I spent 5 or 6 months overborne as a squadron leader on 5, and then went up to Leeming to set up my 4th Tornado Squadron from scratch. 11 Squadron were already up and running at Leeming, and we arrived 23 Squadron as the 2nd Squadron. A 3rd came along later, which was 25, so there were 3 squadrons actually at Leeming at the end.
So what's the role it actually entail?
Well, as the A Flight Commander, OCA, I was responsible for most of the pilots on the squadron. OCB Flight was responsible for most of the navs. Not entirely, but that was the tender, because OCB was a navigator. There was a wing commander boss was a pilot. I, as OCA, was a pilot, and OCB was a navigator. We also had a weapons leader, who was a squadron leader, and a nav leader, who was a squadron leader nav. So there were 5 execs on the squadron. And on top of that, we had a squadron leader, engineering officer.
So did you ever fly on any large exercises with the F3?
Quite a few Elder Forest, Elder Joust, which were big air defence exercises. Also, one of our jobs since the demise of the fixed-wing carriers was to defend the fleet at sea. And so we got involved in quite a few maritime exercises as well, where we CAPS, combat air patrols overhead or near the fleet to protect them from any airborne attack.
And you also flew in the Gulf. Could you tell us about this?
Well, I did fly in the Gulf. I didn't actually fly in the shooting war. What happened when Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq? I was actually at an air display down in Cornwall at St Morgan, and in the middle of the afternoon, it was a Wednesday if I remember rightly, all of a sudden things started to move, and they stopped the display for a while, and the Victor tanker that was there was dragged out of the static display, and off he went and disappeared. Well, what's going on here? And of course there were no mobile phones then, so someone asked me to ring the squadron. And he said, right, well, Iraq have invaded Kuwait, and it looks like we're going to have to go out and defend Saudi. Well, 11 Squadron were already on APC out in Akrotiri, and they went straight out to Dhahran in Saudi Arabia as the initial people. When I got back to Leeming, we were told that we'd be working up for what became Operation Granby or Desert Shield before the shooting started. After the shooting it was Desert Storm. So that was in the August, and we've been asking for some time for chaff and flares, and we've been told there was a new improved radar in the pipeline, but we've been told it was a long way off. So we were, next day, I remember we were in an HS-125 being flown from Leeming, 2 crews, down to Dunsfold, which everyone will know now from Top Gear fame, but then it was British Aerospace Airfield where they used to build the Harriers. Anyway, we landed at Dunsfold in a taxi taken down to Shoreham, which is near Brighton, to a big building, walked inside, and there was a Tornado F3 simulator in there. I said, what's this? He said, oh, well, it's got the new radar in it. You've come down to train on the new radar that you're going to have in the Gulf. What new radar? So anyway, the two crews were trained up over a 3 or 4 day period on this new radar, which was quite different, much more capable. Don't ask me the specifics, but I think the track well scan and the look down was a lot better from what I remember. And also the ECM resilience was much better than the one we had. So I asked, well, why have you got this radar in this simulator down here? He said, oh, well, it's for the Saudis. They haven't got a building to put the simulator in yet. It was supposed to go out last month. We're just lucky it's still here. So the Saudis were going to get a more up-to-date radar than we had on the front line in UK. Anyway, having trained with it, we went back to Leeming, and then we found that we'd been asking for chaff and flares on the aeroplane and been told, no, lead-in time of 2 years, you can't have them yet, there's not enough money, can't possibly have that. Well, they were on the aeroplane in just over 14 days, and we were training with them. And at the back end of August, I think it was 28th, 29th of August, we went out to Dhahran to relieve 11th Squadron, the people out there. I was a flight commander on 23 at the time, as I said, but the squadron that went to Dhahran initially was 11 Desert Eagles, commanded by OC-11, and it was a flight of crews from 11th Squadron, a flight of crews from 23, and a flight of crews from 25 Squadron who went out there. But we were known as 11th Squadron Dhahran at the time. And we were flying combat air patrols up on the Iraqi border. We were out there until just before Christmas. Obviously saw no action, but we did have some interesting moments. We were on cap one day, and my navigator had seen a target. And it was night time, actually, it wasn't day. And he called it to the AWACS and said, we've got a target crossing the border. And this was all on secure radio. And the controller in the AWACS said, no, you haven't. And the navigator was quite insistent. He said, we have. He said, no, you haven't. Oh, okay. So we surmised it was Special Forces helicopters or something like that crossing the border. But most of those sorties were 4.5 hours with tanker support from VC-10s at Bahrain, fully armed all the time. And when we weren't on cap, we were doing training, but again fully armed with live weapons. And there were only 2 outfits who would train with us. The US Marines, with their F-18s, they were quite happy to train with us. The US Air Force didn't want to know because we had live weapons. And our own British Jaguars and Tornadoes. So it was a very interesting time, did a lot of flying then. Went back just before Christmas, as I say. I think we were replaced by 43 who were there when it all kicked off in January. But correlative, the end story, if you like, all the deep maintenance was done in UK, so the airplanes had to be rotated from UK through Dhahran as the months went by, and I led a 4-ship of Tornadoes out to Dhahran to swap over and bring some back for maintenance on the day that the war ended. And the ceasefire was 0500 on the 28th of February, which was exactly the moment that we took off from Leeming. And that was the longest flight I did in a Tornado, over 9 hours, direct, Leeming to Dhahran. We landed there, we gave the aeroplanes to the squadron, had a night's sleep, and then went back to UK. But because the engineering fraternity weren't comfortable about the wear that the engines had, not just because of the lot of flying they'd been doing, but also the sand in the desert and what was going on. They weren't confident about the 9-hour flight back. So we staged through Dechi Mamanu, which was about 5 hours, I think, from Dhahran to Dechi. And we landed there, and we were feted by everyone on the ground. Oh, you've just come from Dhahran, the war's over, lovely, have a beer. and we've got a barbecue organised for you, because they thought we'd been out there for the war. They didn't realise we'd gone out the day before. So we didn't enlighten them, we just enjoyed their hospitality, and the next day flew back to UK.
So did you enjoy going back to air?
Yes, I did. I enjoyed going back to the air defence environment very much. As I said earlier on, the challenges are different. You don't know what's going to happen when you go. I have to say, for its role, the GR1 was a much more capable aeroplane than the F3. I would much rather have had something like an F-15 or an F-14 for the air defence of UK. But we made the best of what we had, and I think we did a pretty good job. Having said that, it's notable that none of the F3s saw any action out in the Gulf.
So overall, did you enjoy your time on the F3?
I did, yeah, I did. I got used to the two-seat environment, realised that it was always good to have someone else helping you to operate the aeroplane. It was a good time.
So Pax, what happened after you left the RAF?
Well, bad timing. I left in June of 1991, which of course was just after the first Gulf War. And British Airways had just bought Dan Air for £1, and Air Europe had just gone bust. So there was a glut of very well qualified pilots out there, guys with ratings on 737s and Airbus 320s. I did have an ATPL license, but my type was a little piston twin, so getting a job was never really going to happen at that stage. So I ended up going out into Africa, and I flew light twins in Africa for just on 2 years, which was great fun, a wonderful experience. I thoroughly enjoyed it. From Nairobi, we used to fly 2 scheduled services a day into the Masai Mara. We did flying doctor work, we did aid work, and charter work as well. So it was great fun. I did a lot of flying in some wonderful scenery, lots of safaris, and nights spent in the bush. It was great fun.
Brilliant. And what other airlines did you fly for?
Well, when I came back from Africa, things were starting to pick up, but it still wasn't easy to get a job. So I did take the first one I was offered, which was Boeing 727s, flying cargo for Hunting Cargo Airlines. And the 72 was a lovely aeroplane. I really thoroughly enjoyed that. The aeroplanes were on the Irish register, funnily enough, because although Hunting was a British airline, and there were already 727s on the British register with Dan Air, or had been with Dan Air, they had never had a cargo aeroplane. And the CAA said, well, if you want to put a 727 with a cargo door on the register, you're going to have to go through the whole certification process. So Hunting thought, this is going to be silly. So they set up Hunting Cargo Airlines Ireland. And they had Electras and 727s. We had 10 727s. We worked for TNT and DHL and flew all over Europe. The airline was sold to the South Africans and eventually became air contractors. But the 727 was coming to the end of its life because of noise. The airplane was still very capable, but the regulations in Europe meant it could no longer fly because of the noise made by the jet engines. And DHL had just bought 42 757s from British Airways. Half of them went on the Belgian register, and the other half went onto the British register, and the airline was based at East Midlands Airport. And initially we were seconded from air contractors to DHL and then given the opportunity to leave one airline and join the other. And I went straight into DHL 757s as a captain and saw out the rest of my career there.
So how long did you fly civil aircraft for?
Well, I spent 23 years in the Air Force, and I spent 23 years flying 72s and 75s. And I'm hoping to spend 23 years flying general aviation airplanes as well.
So Pax, do you have any hobbies?
Well, flying still. We have a share in a light airplane, and Elena enjoys flying. She started her training and did 8 solos, so we share the flying, and that's good fun. I'm into photography, and I've taken up gardening in a more proactive way than I used to. I used to just be the labourer. Elena would direct and I would dig, rake or whatever, but I've actually got a little rose garden now which I'm trying to get to grips with.
Very nice. So what's your favourite aircraft?
That is a very tricky question. I've been lucky enough to fly lots of different types. I thoroughly enjoyed flying the Tiger Moth. That was good fun. And I thoroughly enjoyed the Gnat when I was in training for the Air Force. From civilian aeroplanes, the 727 was great fun as well. So it would have to be a choice between either the Tiger Moth, the Chipmunk as a light aeroplane, the Gnat as a fast jet, if you like, and the 727.
Nice.
But making a choice is a bit difficult.
Is there one you wish you could have flown?
I would very much like to have flown the F-15 or the F-18. That would have been great. And I did try to organise a trip in the front seat of a two-seat Spitfire, but unfortunately that came to nothing. Elena did offer to buy me a backseat ride, but if I'm going to fly it, I want to fly it. So
Of course.
there we go.
And finally, do you ever get sick of talking about aviation?
No, and thankfully people don't seem to get sick of me talking about it.